This is ContraZoom.
Where we go back and forth about film.
I'm Dakota Arsenault.
And I'm Rachel Ho.
We are back covering the Toronto Japanese Film Festival for the third year in a row. The film festival gives Japanese films either their international, North American, or Canadian debuts after playing in Japan. Today, we will be discussing 4 films that we watched, 3 of them that we both saw, and 1 that I saw. As I said, it is our third year covering the fest, and it's also the first year that your site, the Asian Cut, has covered it. How did you find this year's edition, Rachel?
I liked it. I think I wasn't overly impressed when I first saw the lineup. Like, just kind of looking at it, there weren't too many things that jumped out at me. And I know I only saw 3 films, but I was actually very happy with 2.5 of them. I was happy with 2.5 of them. And actually, probably more appropriately is saying 2 of them. But I was glad to find like a couple that I really loved. Like, I would rather that than watch, say, 5 movies and be like, yeah, they're all good, and not really have any strong feelings. But like the 2 that I am quite high on, I'm very, very high on them. So I like that. I like that kind of worked out that way. And it's a nice festival. Like, Toronto has so many different film festivals around the city, more than I think people really realize how many films are. Like, I was going to say Oakland, Oakville. Oakville's got a film festival. Vaughan's got a film festival. There's just so many. And then there's obviously the cultural film festivals, like the Japanese Film Festival. So I love going to them because I think that they're actually very well done. They're typically fairly organized. And this one's done at the Japanese Canadian Cultural Center in Toronto. And it's a cute little venue. And I think they always they've done a really great job in the 2 times that I've gone, but they do a good job, and it looks really nice. And this year, I think because it was more open than last year. Last year, it was still a bit kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out in terms of what was going on with COVID and lockdowns and things like that. But this year, I think, was kind of full throttle, and they did a really great job, I thought.
Yeah, I agree. It's always sort of a little bit tricky with looking at the lineup of trying to figure out what you want to watch, because yes, it is the best movies coming out of Japan, but it's not like the sort of big name directors that, the rest of the international movie going world knows of. It's not like they're showing Hamaguchi movies or Takeshi Miike movies or things like that where you really know the brand of the director. So you're kind of like being like, oh, I don't know who this director is. I don't really recognize these actors for the most part. So it's a little tricky trying to figure out what is your style. And you're often kind of left going off the poster, because I feel like, ironically, the posters of these movies kind of give you more of an idea of the feel than the description does, because they're very good at being like, okay, if it's a comedy movie, we're going to make this poster really bright and colorful and lots of people and all this sort of stuff. And then the more dramatic ones, there's going to be lots of shadows, so you can't really tell what's going on, all that sort of stuff. So it does sort of help in that sense of trying to pick out movies. But yeah, it is a little tricky of nailing a really good movie or one that you're a little more mixed on.
Yeah, and I think, this is nothing to say about the copywriter for the Toronto Japanese Film Festival's website. But sometimes I find the descriptions, they don't really do the film justice. And I guess you could say that for any film description. Mm-hmm. Like, if you're just reading a 2-3 line synopsis, sometimes there's a great hook for movies, but sometimes there's not, because movies can sound kind of dull when you just look at the pitch, but actually they end up being pretty great.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think you're right though. Like, this is a smaller film festival. I believe I know definitely in Ontario, it's the only Japanese film festival. So it's not like TIFF, right? Like, what you were saying about the bigger names and in terms of directors and actors, those guys will probably submit their films to go into TIFF and VIFF and those types of film festivals, rather than smaller ones. Although we're going to talk about it. Plan 75 did, I don't want to say debuted at TIFF, but it did have some sort of premiere at TIFF last year, and they were billing it as they were billing the screening as like kind of the encore TIFF presentation. Mm-hmm. That's the way that they posed it. So you do kind of get the quote unquote leftovers of some of the more prestigious film festivals, but I kind of like that. Like, I like that it's not just the big ones, because those are easy enough for us to find. You know, what was the big name for the year? What was the big draw for the year? Coming out of Japan, but it's nice to find little films, I suppose, and filmmakers who we wouldn't normally hear from in Canada, and so it's yeah, I find that pretty nice. And I know last year there was a movie that came out that I really loved, in that I saw at the Toronto Japanese Film Festival, and same with you actually. But I think both of us had in our top tens. Maybe it was the year before, but we both had movies that we had seen at this festival that ended up making into our top tens, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, for me it was Under the Open Sky, which is an actor that's going to pop up in one of the other movies that we're going to talk about, the one that I saw as well. So that's kind of cool.
I can't for the life of me remember what mine was, as much as I did really love it. I can't remember the name of it, but I know that it was Ribbon. It was called Ribbon.
Oh, yes.
A singular word. It was just called Ribbon. But I really love that movie, and yeah, I think that's neat though. I think it's I thought that was pretty funny that both of us had something from that festival, like the most innocuous festival that we probably attend. And yet we both found something that was in our top tens. So I think that's pretty cool.
Absolutely. All right. Well, then in that case, let's start talking about the movies. Well, I'll kind of introduce them, and I'm going to read the plot synopsis that the TJFF does provide, and hopefully it is sufficient enough that people kind of know what we're talking about a little bit, because obviously I imagine most people have not heard of these movies. So the first one that we're going to talk about, as you've already talked about there, was Plan 75. It was directed by, and I apologize in advance if I mispronounce any Japanese names, Chi Hayakawa. And as you also said, it's being listed as the TIFF Encore presentation. And so the plot summary is, with nearly 1/3 of Japan's population over the age of 65 and the lowest birth rates in the world, the country faces a historic economic and healthcare crisis. In response, the government created Plan 75, where senior citizens over 75 are encouraged to voluntarily euthanize themselves for the benefit of younger generations. Soon, government facilities are crowded with seniors like Michi, a 78-year-old cleaning lady with a precarious living situation, who, for 100,000 yen, will be put to death. Bureaucrats like Hiramu and immigrant worker Maria both benefit professionally from the system, but beneath the surface, everyone is left questioning the morality of all. Now, this movie was actually nominated for 2 categories at last year's Japan Academy Film Prize, which included Best Screenplay and Best Actress for Chiko Beisho, who plays Michi. And it was also Japan's submission for the Best International Film Oscar, but did not get nominated last year. So this is, as you were kind of talking about earlier, this is probably one of Japan's biggest movies of last year, definitely, and probably of the last few years in terms of the way they are presenting it to the rest of the movie-going world. You went and went to the screening in person. Am I right with that?
I did, yeah. I went with Rose and Alicia actually for the Asian Cut. We had like a little Asian Cut field trip for this one, and we actually had a review of this on the site already from Jericho, who is one of our regular contributors. I think we've actually called him a critic at large, I think is what we call him. But I have to admit, there was a lot of hype out of this movie because of everything you said. Like it had a premiere at TIFF. It was Japan's submission for the Oscars. It did win, it was nominated for a ton of awards. So I just kind of expected it to be something really great. And it's about a topic that I'm actually very interested in. I think that what's going on in Japan in terms of their population demographics is very fascinating. Like everyone kind of saw this coming for decades now. Everyone knew that this was going to be I hate to call it a problem, but it was going to be something that was going to need to
be addressed.
Yes, thank you. The government was going to need to address it at some point. And so I think it's a fascinating topic. And I don't know, this movie just didn't quite do it for me. Like there's a bit of a science fiction element to it in terms of they're living in this, world with an augmented reality of this program. But it's neither. I didn't find it, this might sound terrible on my part, I didn't find it overly unsettling, which is what I thought I would find it to be. it is sad in theory, but I didn't necessarily find the movie very sad. I suppose I just didn't find it very moving in a good way or in a bad way, this film. And I think that it's, like, again, it talks about something that's really interesting. I think that Chico Beisho, her performance is amazing. I think she's great in this movie. But yeah, it just didn't connect with me in any, not in any way. I shouldn't say in any way, because there were moments that I thought were pretty great. But just as a whole, it wasn't one that really connected with me and that really drove me to be like, oh, right, I understand why this movie has gotten XYZ praise.
Yeah, I'm definitely in the same boat with you, and I end up having to watch this movie in 2 sittings. And so I watched the first hour of it, and I had to stop it, and I was like, okay, I don't know what this movie's actually about at this point. Like, I understand the plot of, it's about people over the age of 75 signing up for assisted suicide or self-euthanization, as they're calling it. But I was like, but I don't actually know what the story they're trying to tell with this is. And I didn't realize it was even being billed as a sci-fi film, because, I don't know, this doesn't feel like a sci-fi film at all. Mm-hmm. Like, it totally seems like something a sort of a progressive country would start to offer, of like, hey, we can help cover the costs of your funeral, and you can leave some money for your loved ones if you are feeling like you're in poor health. Instead of wanting to be a strain on the system, you can choose this option to kind of go out on your own terms, sort of thing. And that doesn't sound, when you sort of describe it, it sounds a little sci-fi, but the way it's presented, it's not a sci-fi concept in this movie at all. And I was very confused, because the movie opens with someone committing suicide, but it's a young person, and they use a shotgun and they shoot themselves. And I'm like, oh, okay, this has got my attention. Very interesting. Where is this going to go? And it really wasn't until like 10 minutes left in the film that I was like, oh, I know what this is in connection to. And then the movie ends, but doesn't do the thing where it like reconnects the beginning.
Yeah.
So for the longest time, I thought legitimately that was the beginning of the movie, not the end of the movie. And then it doesn't connect it at the end. And I was like, yeah, was it? Is this the person I think it was? And so I was very confused about all that, where I was just like, I don't really know what's going on here.
I agree. Like, the beginning is so startling. It's such like, what a way to start a movie, right? Like, it's actually very gripping, and it is telling you like I don't know. It's like feeding you, saying this is this kind of movie. It's a kind of movie that it's borderline horror. It's thrilling. There's something going on here, and it's clearly devastating.
There's going to be a mystery, and you're going to have to figure out what the mystery is.
Absolutely.
And it's not.
And then you hit the end of the movie, and then for me, it was kind of walking out, and I was like, wait, hold on. What happened with the beginning? Yeah. I was like, what was the point of that? And then actually Rose mentioned that she had looked this movie up previously, like before I think we watched it on Letterboxd, and somebody said that beginning actually happened in Japan. Like, it's something that was pulled from the headlines of a young person who was working at a nursing home, and I think they just kind of couldn't take it anymore. I mean, I have to assume mentally they weren't very well, and they just kind of reached the end of their own tether, and they ended up killing a bunch of people in the nursing home and then killing themselves afterwards. So I get the tie-in, like, I see where that kind of works, but I would agree with you. I think neither of us are really people that we need a movie to spell things out for us. Like, we don't need that step, that extra exposition to be put into a film. But this was one where you're just like, wait, what was the point of the beginning? Like, it didn't come back around full circle in the end. And I don't mind an ambiguous ending, and this movie is arguably has a bit of an ambiguous ending. But it felt odd that it started in a place that it doesn't end anywhere near that place. Yeah. So you kind of wonder what was the point of throwing that in, other than just saying this is ripped from the headlines and it's related to the movie that we're making, which to me is not a good enough reason, really.
I also think sort of one of the bigger issues with this movie is it tries to be a bit of an ensemble type movie, focusing on 3 different storylines, but they don't give the time that they need to each of the characters and every time that they are, changing to a different storyline, it sort of takes away from the other storylines as well. And so you're left with knowing both too much and too little about these sort of side plots, because it sort of focuses on three characters. You've got Michi, who is an older woman who has signed up for Plan 75 and sort of is having her doubts about it, about whether she wants to actually go through with it or not. And then you have a young man named Hiramu who works for Plan 75, and his sort of role seems to be registering elderly people up for this program and sort of doing their assessment report and all that sort of stuff and answering questions for them. But then on the side, he clearly feels that Plan 75 is this like cold bureaucratic thing that he doesn't have a connection to. So he volunteers at soup kitchens and things like that, where he's actually seems to be involved in the community. And you sort of wonder if he feels that there's a different way to go forward. I'm like, oh, that's very interesting. And then you also have a third person, a Filipino caretaker named Maria, who is trying to raise money to help pay for her young son's surgery back home in the Philippines. So I basically also described it in the order of the importance of the storylines. And so by the time we get down to Maria's storyline, I frankly just don't have the bandwidth to really care, because they give her enough time that you're like, okay, what is this character and sort of what's her deal, but not enough time for me to actually be invested in her storyline. And that really hindered, because every time she came on screen, that meant that either Michi or Hiramu were not getting screen time and we weren't furthering their stories instead.
Completely agree. I think we're very much on the same wavelength with this movie. Mm-hmm. It's just a lot. Like, I think Michi's story, that's enough. Like, in honesty, that was enough for me. Yeah. And that was, I actually, from everything I knew about the movie, I didn't realize there was 3 different plot lines going on that don't, they kind of connect to each other in the end in a slight way. Like, in a way of just they're in the same vicinity with each other. Yes. Like they're in the same place, but it doesn't come like, I think if they came together in a, I hate to say it like this way, like in a Love Actually way, where like the plot lines kind of tied together, I think maybe I would have been a bit more receptive to something like that. But I didn't find it. There was no reward to that. There was no benefit to having 3 different plot lines. If we just focus on Michi, that is such an interesting story, and her relationship with the social worker, if you will, that is assigned to her, that I found so interesting. I could watch an entire movie just about that and the process that she goes through in signing up for this program. That is enough. That's more than enough for a movie like this, and actually is in keeping with the idea of the title of the film, which is just about the program. I understand, I suppose, where they're trying to come from and trying to give a more holistic view of what this would have looked like the different people involved in it that are affected by this kind of a program. Again, it's like one of those, in theory, it makes sense. Yes. And in theory, I see what they're doing, but I just don't think it really worked out very well when it actually played out. And it's such a shame, because I thought the idea for this movie is actually really, really interesting and really brilliant. And it could have been a really, really thought-provoking type of film for not just Japan, but all over the world. We have this issue of an increasingly mature population, and everybody needs to figure out, like, there's going to have to be a change in infrastructure all over the world. So it's not just something that is prevalent in Japan. It is maybe more prevalent in Japan than in other countries, but it's something that every single country is going to have to deal with in the next 20 some odd years. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a shame that this movie fell a bit flat. Just with us, though, because it seems to be like people like it. So I don't know what our problem is.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it was just us. What did Rose and Alicia think of it?
I think both of them were kind of on the same. They were a bit lukewarm to it. They were a little lukewarm on it. But I didn't know if it was just because after so many months of hearing so much hype about it, that maybe we all kind of psyched ourselves out for this movie. But and so sometimes when I think a movie, the hype or expectation of a movie might have ruined it or elevated it for me, I try to give a bit of space and then rewatch it sometime down the road. But I have no really urge to rewatch this one.
Yeah.
I don't really think that it's going to be like, I don't know if I'm really going to have a different mind frame on this. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, let us move on to maybe something a little bit more positive. And we're going to talk about a movie called BLMetamorphosis, which was directed by Shunsuke Kiriyama. And it was the Canadian premiere of the movie. And the plot is Urara is a socially awkward 17-year-old high school student who doesn't have any friends or a boyfriend. Her only enjoyment is secretly reading boys love manga. She works part-time as a cashier at a bookstore where she meets 78-year-old widow Yuki. Yuki happens to buy a BL manga due to its eye-pleasing cover and is soon a fan of the manga genre. So, as the title suggests, BL Metamorphosis, BL stands for boys love. It basically is a form of queer storytelling where it focuses on two young, attractive men who fall in love with each other. And it's quite funny because I remember back when I was in high school, you know, every school has like the few kids who are like really into anime and manga and stuff like that. And there were a couple girls in my grade who were really into it. And they basically only, I think, exclusively read boys love manga because every once in a while they'd be like, oh, look at this. Aren't you grossed out by this? Oh my gosh. Like that sort of thing, as young people will do. And so it's sort of funny seeing a movie about it now 15 years later about that exact genre of manga. But as sort of ridiculous as the plot synopsis sort of sounds, it's a really sweet movie. And I think it's one that both you and I sort of appreciate. It's lighthearted nature. The runtime is definitely a little bit better than something like Plan 75. It's a bit short. Actually, no, it's about the same. No, it is. It's the same. They're both 2 hours. Never mind. It just felt a lot faster.
What an indictment on Plan 75, by the way.
Yeah, wow. And much like Plan 75 in the sense of like there's three sort of main storylines, BL Metamorphosis has two main storylines, but at least they're connected enough that we care about both of their stories. And they do a good enough job sort of servicing both of their characters. And this is just a really sweet and adorable movie, you know, headlined by, once again, an older actress, Kotune Furukawa, who plays Yuki, or Yu Komada, who does a really great job, and I think was the real shining point of this movie for me.
I really love this movie, too. It was such a sweet, sweet movie, and everything about I just said it to you just before we started recording, but it's like this is such a nice tonic to watch after Plan 75, because it deals with not the same thing, but it just deals with, you know, an elderly person, and sometimes those stories can be kind of sad, but this one's not. It's not sad at all, and it's very uplifting film. And I think sometimes, especially me, I tend to go towards movies that are not so uplifting. So whenever I do come across one that I like and that doesn't feel overly schmaltzy or cheesy, even though there are moments in this one that do definitely lay on like a bit of the schmaltz, I don't mind it because I'm like, this is just it's that genre of film of the warm blanket film.
Yes.
Like it's just so comforting to watch something. And I would 100% watch this movie again. Like I just think it's such a sweet, sweet movie. And both of the performances are great. And, you know, you brought up how there is this kind of other storyline, but it does eventually tie in. And that was one that I remember watching it when it first pops up, and I thought, oh god, they're going to do this thing where it's like there's this random storyline that I really won't care about, but then it really ties together nicely and organically, and it makes sense. So I can't say enough good things about this movie. This was the one that I messaged a couple people while I was watching it, being like, you guys need to watch this movie because I think it's just so sweet. And I love the idea of, you know, and anytime there's movies about older people and younger people becoming friends, I find it very, very cute because I think that there's such, like, there seems to be a lot of, especially nowadays, I think that we feel like we have to like dig our feet in when we talk about generations. I don't know why we do that to ourselves. Like we really feel like you're a millennial, you're a Gen X, you're a baby boomer, you're a Gen Z. Like we have become very tribal in that sense. And so anytime that there are movies now that have that generation bridge, I find them just very, they're very warm and they're very sweet because there's a lot more that I think bridges, and there's a lot more commonalities between like old and young people than I think a lot of people, especially today, give credit for. And I think this movie does a really, really good job of illustrating that.
Yeah, and I think it was nice because neither character looks down on the other person due to their age. They both are able to kind of teach each other things and be respectful to each other in a way that feels authentic and not just like, oh, they're being cute for the movie sake. Like, you know, I think both are sort of excited to share their passions with each other.
Yeah.
Which is really nice.
There's this Instagram channel of a British guy who's really into train spotting. And I love trains too. I'm a big train fan. But this guy takes it to like a whole other level. And his videos, you can, if you go through the comments, there are people who are like, I came here to completely, like, because it's British. They're like, I came here to take the piss because I was just going to make fun of this guy for loving trains as much as he does. But then when you actually watch the video, you can't help but be taken by how much joy he gets out of trains. Like just a train going by him at the station, because there's something very special about this particular train. There's something very infectious. And I think given how negative we can be nowadays, it's just a nice reprieve from that when you see somebody so genuinely passionate about something, anything. And I think there's something really sweet about sharing that love and that passion with the world. So this movie, because I just found that account like 2 weeks ago. So when I'm like, that's been like on top of mind of just this idea of getting joy out of things that might seem a bit ridiculous. Like your hobbies might seem kind of silly to some people. But this one is like, the girl doesn't, like at the beginning, the young girl doesn't want to, she's kind of embarrassed about how much she loves her manga, like, and this particular brand of manga. And she's, you know, not wanting to fully reveal how much she loves it, how into it she is. But then when she realizes, you know, this woman is just as into it as I am, and they start talking about, like, oh, I think the character's too timid. And like, yes, I think the exact same thing. I'm like, I love that, because I think that there's something really special about sharing just a passion for something, anything that you have with somebody else, and finding that person that like kind of connects with you on that. And you can just be very authentic about how nerdy you are about a particular subject.
And I think to kind of go back, you're talking about the one sort of side storyline that at first doesn't really make sense. I'm guessing you're talking about how the two main characters decide that they're going to make their own manga, and so they're working on it, but then there's a side plot of their favorite manga author who is clearly experiencing some sort of writer's block and something like that, and feeling the pressures of deadlines and all that sort of stuff. And so we get several cutscenes back to this author as she's sort of struggling to write a book, and you're just like, I don't really know where this is going or why this is happening and all that sort of stuff. And truth be told, I would be fine if they sort of removed several of those scenes. And in fact, there's a scene, you know, about 3/4 of the way through the book when the movie, where they finally are trying to sell this homemade manga at a convention, and the Yuki, the older lady, is stranded and she wasn't able to make it, and she comes across another woman who said, "Oh, I was coming from the convention. What you got there?" And she ends up buying a copy of it. And I would have rewritten that scene just a little bit, because the writer sort of lies about who she is, and I just would have taken that line out completely. Don't even give the option of that, because then it would have been a really nice reveal. We'd still get this really nice reveal later on when the story fully connects back to it, but I think it would have been even more satisfying if she didn't have to lie about who she was at first.
It does feel kind of tropey, doesn't it? It's like because she's got sunglasses on. So no, like, even though I don't think she would have recognized her anyways, but yeah, and the way that those scenes that you talk about, like the scenes where you see the author working on her stuff, they come out of nowhere all of a sudden. Like it just kind of was like, oh, and I was like, I was like, who is this girl? I was like, did I miss something? Because I was doing laundry at the same time. So I thought maybe I missed something. And then I was like, who is this girl? And then you figure it out, obviously. But it does come out of nowhere. But again, like unlike Plan 75, I don't mean to bash on Plan 75, but just in a comparison between the two, it's like when those two extra storylines are brought up in Plan 75, it doesn't feel shocking. Like it doesn't just kind of appear out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
It kind of makes sense the way that all three characters are introduced, but they just never come together. Whereas in this one, in BLMetamorphosis, that particular storyline, it does feel like it's just this random wild thing that appears, but in the end it creates probably, I'd say, the most emotional moment in the film, like right at the end there, at the manga signing. So it works really well, and it's it's kind of interesting comparing the filmmaking between the two, and like just the decisions on the script and kind of the editing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely one worth checking out.
Yes.
If people have the opportunity to see it, I do highly recommend it.
It's a nice summer movie too, I think. It's like a great movie for
it's very
the summer,
breezy.
I think. Yeah.
It's always tough with these movies because I don't know, we don't often see them pop up on Netflix or something like that unless it's an original production by one of these streaming companies. So I have no idea if there's going to be the opportunity for people to see them again. So I don't know.
On that note, there was a movie that I saw at TIFF in 2021, I think, and it was called The Loners, and it was a Korean movie, and it just got, like, I think a week or two ago, it just got a VOD release in North America. And I had not forgotten about it because I love that movie, but I saw it pop up and I went, oh, wow, like it took that long for it to get a digital release. Not even talking theatrical, like just for it to be available for people to buy or rent over here. And I thought that was insane. So maybe in 2 years' time, this one will appear as well in VOD.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe. That'd be nice, obviously. Okay, let us move on to our next one, which is a movie called Rollless, which has 3 directors, Masahiko Sato, Yutaro Sekai, Kentaro Hirase, and it is the Canadian premiere of this movie. And the plot is Miyamatsu divides his modest life between jobs as a cable car operator and an extra in Japanese gangster and samurai films. With no family, friends, or memories of the past, he sleepwalks through life. Through a chance meeting, he is confronted with a different life, his own. His true name is Yamashita. He has a sister and a history he decides to investigate. So this movie is really interesting because it once again sort of takes the approach of being almost like 2 different movies. So we get this, the first half of this movie, very interesting, where it's a sort of lonely guy and it's in between jobs. And I loved all the scenes of him being on film set. It isn't quite exactly how it works being an extra in movies. Maybe it's a little bit different in Japan. I don't know. But it was still very cool to sort of see the behind the scenes look at the way they want to depict the movie industry, which I thought was very fascinating. And just sort of this lonely guy. And you're sort of wondering about like what's his deal and how he's living his life and all this sort of stuff, and you feel really bad for him. And then the second half shifts once he runs into someone that used to know him, but he doesn't remember him, and he's like, "Hey, your sister's looking for you. She hasn't heard from you in years. Are you ever going to talk to her? Like, what's going on?" And he's like, "I don't know you, and I don't have a sister." And then we learn that he used to work as a taxi driver, and we get shown a flashback of him injuring his head. And then we're like, oh, he's got amnesia. And so then he ends up being reintroduced to his sister and her family and all that sort of stuff. And then the movie sort of unravels a bit more, and then you start to question, wait, does he remember what's going on? Does he forget? Does he choose to forget what's going on? It actually almost started to feel like a Park Chan-wook film where you're wondering how much the character actually knows and what the reveal is going to be. And I really appreciated that. And this was a very sort of subtle, blank performance where you can really sort of put yourself onto the character. The actor that's playing Miyamatsu, his name is, I'm really going to butcher this, Teruyuki Kagawa. And he was fantastic. I really loved his performance. What did you think of this movie?
I really enjoyed it. I think it's such an interesting idea. Just looking at extras. I know there was a TV show about that too, which is very, very different to this movie. But I found that part fascinating. Like, I liked how they also clipped it together in terms of the scenes that we see, like they look like that's just what's happening in his life. Like it doesn't look like we don't.
And it kept confusing me too. I was like, "Oh, is this really what's happening?" No, okay, this is a movie set. Never mind.
I love that. Like I love that they don't change the lens. They don't do anything to make it be like, "Oh, this is reality and this is the film set." Like it all looks the same, and so it really plays with your head sometimes, because by the time you reach the switch in the movie, you start to go, "Wait, is this?" And it takes you a second to be like, oh, no, this is actually happening to him in real life. And I suppose that goes into this character who is, you know, like you said, he's quite lonely and probably a little bit depressed. And it's that idea of, you know, his line is blurred too between what his actual reality is, which I don't think he's very happy with, versus the ability to live as a, you know, as a like a Yakuza gangster, or like, you know, like just to kind of live out these little fantasies that people have. So I love that. Like I think that in terms of the filmmaking, in terms of storytelling, I thought that was so interesting, the way that they did that. The other part with the amnesia, that again, it's one of those things that comes out of nowhere and you go, oh, interesting. And then it builds this. We talked about runtime with the other two films, and this one is like, I think under 90 minutes, I want to say.
Yeah, it's an hour 25.
Which is so rare for a Japanese film, because Japanese movies tend to run kind of long. And the amount that they're able to fit into this movie, I found really fascinating. Like you described it perfectly, of like, it's effectively two movies, but then even at the end of that second movie, it unravels into something that is entirely different from the other two things that we've already seen. And how you're able to do that within a relatively short period of time, I find very, very impressive. I completely agree with you about the lead performance. I think he's fantastic. Although his eyebrows really bothered me. Eyebrows really bother me in movies sometimes. When people have either too dark or too light eyebrows, it really, I find it difficult to ignore. But I thought he was great. And yeah, everything about this movie I think the Park Chan-wook analogy is very apt. I think that's the kind of film that it almost looks like it's going to become, but then it never fully becomes that either.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating. Like this to me is just a really interesting movie in terms of building a story and how you're going to execute that story on screen. And again, really great performances to kind of compound that.
Yeah, I've only seen 3 Park movies, and it's Old Boy, The Handmaiden, and Decision to Leave. And it's definitely nothing like Old Boy or The Handmaiden, which is, you know, so insane movies. And it's obviously not like Decision to Leave, but it's a little bit closer in the terms of, I don't want to call it a will he or won't he sort of thing, but it's a little bit more of a mystery and not so much an out and out, you know, balls to the wall type of movie that Park's other movies are. And so there are a few moments where there's a little bit of violence, and because there's also this movie sort of career aspect to it, you're like, oh, what is this connected to that? Is it not? And there's a couple times that it is, and there's a couple times that it isn't as well. And so I think that's where I'm sort of I'm making the Park comparisons, is you don't know what's real and what's not until after the scene is over. And I sort of appreciate that aspect as well.
It's very interesting for a movie that you think is just going to be about show business, right? Like you kind of go into it thinking, oh, this is just an interesting movie about being an extra and maybe and about a man who's not fulfilled in his life. And so maybe he's trying to find fulfillment in doing this, but even in, no offense to people who are background actors, but it's like, you're not the star of the show either in those situations. So, you know, that is, you could do a whole movie on that, and that's already interesting. So it's just interesting that you end up in a space that it's like, what the hell's going on? Like it's like I can't keep saying the word interesting, but it's just a really, really fascinating way of telling this story. And it's almost as if you kind of like, it's like he had 2 great ideas for 2 short films, and then he tied them together somehow. And it works. That's the funny thing, is that it works, because I think on paper it doesn't sound like it should work, but it really does work.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil too much about, but you know, the main thing about the second half of this movie is you're left wondering towards the end if this man really does have amnesia or some sort of head injury that caused him to have short-term memory loss and things like that. That we get that seed of doubt. and we don't really get a proper resolution of whether or not he really does remember or forget his past. And so I sort of appreciate that it's left up to the audience. But yeah, you're watching it, and so once they plant that seed of doubt, there's this one scene that takes place in a baseball batting cage. And as soon as that scene happens, the rest of the movie, you're trying to guess what is actually going on. And I think that's really good because it's one of those things where just like a snap of your fingers, you're instantly like, okay, I cannot turn away for a second. I need to give this movie all my attention because I need to figure out what's happening with this guy.
I would like to also take this opportunity to bring up another amnesia-related movie that I have talked about on here before, but just because I like that movie a lot. It's the movie Apples, which is a Greek movie, and it has the same kind of ambiguous ending to it as well. And similar to what you're saying of like in the batting cage, there is that moment. Like that was the moment that you go, oh, maybe not everything's correct. Like there is a similar thing in Apples as well, where you're just like, something's not right here. Like even though you've bought into the world that they have presented you, you realize kind of instantly that they've kind of hoodwinked you in a way, because like they make you feel very comfortable in this world, but then they flip the switch on you, which is a great filmmaking. I mean, that's just good storytelling, isn't it, to be able to do something like that. And I like the way in this film how they, that batting scene, the batting cage scene that you brought up. I like that it's something quite small. Like they use such a casual scene, like a casual circumstance for something like this to trigger the rest of the film basically. And I think that that's really clever, and it's very unassuming, I guess is probably the best word to use. It's a very unassuming way to launch into what is going to end up being a bit of a mind F.
Yeah.
I won't swear.
It's sort of funny when, today we're going to be talking about 4 movies, you 3 of them, 4 for me, where 2 of them we both really liked, and then the other 2 I didn't like as much, and we're going to get into it. And it's sort of interesting that, especially in a film festival setting, where sometimes it takes watching a couple of bad movies to appreciate a good movie and be like, oh, that, the subtlety, that's all you need. You don't need to spell everything out for me. It's, you can have a really big moment be a really small thing that happens. Just, a simple line of dialogue, one, swing of a bat, quite literally, and that completely changes the entire tone and meaning of a movie. And so it's one of those things where you just like, you forget why we love movies sometimes, because we watch so many of them. And like, yep, every movie I watch is great. I enjoy it all. Love, love, love. And then sometimes you need to watch a bad movie to go back and watch a good movie and be like, oh, this is what good filmmaking is. And this is why I like watching movies so much.
I think I have an appreciation too for just how difficult it is to make a good movie.
Yeah.
Like it is so tough. Like, it's a wonder. First off, like I think when you understand more of the behind the scenes of how movies get made, it's a wonder that any movie gets made to begin with, because it seems next to impossible for things to get done. But then to actually create a good movie is so difficult, because the tiniest little thing can either set your movie on a trajectory of this is going to be the next Citizen Kane, or it's just going to put you down a path where it's like such a great idea turns into something that it just turns into something that is not, I don't want to say terrible, but like it's sometimes terrible. And I always think like nobody goes into a movie thinking I'm going to make a bad movie. Like that's never the intention of anybody involved in making movies. So anytime that I try to have that kind of lens when I'm watching films now, because like you said, we watch so many, that it's more difficult to make it's not more difficult. It's just incredibly difficult to make a good movie. And the tiniest little thing can just change everything. And it's, like I said, it's a wonder. It's a wonder that there are great movies in the world, because sometimes it's just a bit of luck as well, I think. So, sometimes it's a stroke of luck. But a film like Rollless, I really, really appreciate the filmmaking on it. Just more so almost than the actual story itself. Like I just appreciate how they're able to tie in all these things together, all these little moments together to make it something very coherent, but also very kind of poignant and very like thought-provoking and things like that. And there is depth, but there's also just general suspense and thrills that you don't expect in a movie that has the kind of depth that it does. And there are also kind of some comedic moments as well. Not many.
Yeah.
Not many.
There's one last scene I kind of want to, highlight that I really liked, and it involves a little bit of a setup here. So obviously we see quite a few of his scenes of him working in movies. And so it starts out with him being in a samurai movie. And so right away we know, this is a movie because he's decked out in a samurai costume and things like that. And obviously this is a present day movie. And then, the next one we get, it's him in a bar, and then he gets shot silently. You're like, what is going on here? And then you realize it's a Yakuza gangster style movie. And so we get a few of these scenes where it's like heightened violence. Okay, we know it's actually a movie sort of thing. But then there's a scene a little bit into it where he goes into a bathroom, he's brushing his teeth, and then a woman comes in and she's also brushing her teeth, and they start talking. And at this point, we don't really know a ton about this man's backstory, about who he is outside of, his jobs that he has, his two jobs, being a cable car operator and then being a movie set extra. And you're like, oh, maybe, this is his reality. And they're having this interesting conversation about where their family life is going, and it's very intense and quiet and intimate. And then all of a sudden they yell cut. And I was just like, oh my God, I did not think that this was a movie scene. I thought this was an actual scene of this guy's life. It was just one of those like little moments that once again sort of like blew my mind. Of every time, it seemed like every like 15, 20 minutes, there was a scene where I was just like, oh my God, that was an incredible scene.
The way that he backs out of that scene too, like when they call cut and then the actress like bolts, she gets out of the scene so quickly,
and she's the star.
And he just kind of hangs around for a second. Like he just takes like that beat of just like, I want to live in this moment just a little bit longer, and then he like slowly saunters over and looks at the screen, and they're just like, all right, yeah, you're good, you're done for the day, good job, bye. And I'm like, oh my God, it's kind of funny, but it's also heartbreaking. Like I found at first, like I didn't laugh, but I was just like, oh, that's funny. Like, and he just kind of like, then I was like, oh, this is not funny anymore. This is just very sad. I was like, this is a very, very sad moment that I'm watching. But it's, like I said before, where you and I aren't people that necessarily need like exposition for everything. Mm-hmm. Everything in that, there's so much that is being said in that one scene, and there's not that much dialogue going on. Like it's the dialogue of the scene that they're doing, but then besides that, it's quite quiet. But yet, that moment says so much about this one particular guy who, as you said, we don't know anything about him really, especially to that point in the film. Like we just don't know what his deal is. He's just kind of a nameless guy who's just. He's an extra. He's a background actor in a film.
Yeah. Really incredible movie. And I think of all the movies that we're going to talk about today, if someone is able to see this movie, this is definitely the one to check out because it's so fascinating.
Yeah. Especially if you're like a big movie nerd and you just like looking at that kind of stuff. I think it's a very, very fascinating movie to watch.
Yeah. Okay. And then the last movie that I'm going to talk about is one called Father of the Milky Way Railroad, which was directed by Izuru Nurushima, and it was the international premiere of the movie. And it is about a man who was born in 1896, a novelist and poet of children's literature. Kenji Miyazawa is now one of Japan's most read and best-loved authors. It was not until after his death at only 33 that his work became widely recognized. His father, Masajiro, wants Kenji to take over his pawn shop business, but Kenji refuses, wishing to go his own way by exploring agriculture and Buddhism, among other things. Masajiro tries to be a strict father, but ends up being supportive. When Toshi, Kenji's younger sister, and the one who understands him the best, becomes ill, Kenji starts to devote himself to writing. So this movie was sort of being advertised as the movie that stars the recent Cannes Best Actor winner Koji Yakusho. Oh man, I messed that up. Koji Yakusho. His movie post-winning Best Actor at Cannes. And so you're left wondering, oh, is this the movie that he won Best Actor for? But they don't really specify that. It's not. He recently won Best Actor for the new Wim Wenders movie Perfect Days, which is not out wide yet. So it's a little bit of false advertisement as that. But I was excited because, as we said earlier on, I saw him several years ago in the movie Under the Open Sky, that if you listen back to that TJFF episode, I was very, very high on and end up making, I think it made my best of the year so far, the halfway through the year list, but I think it was an honorable mention by the time I did my end of the year list. But he might have made like my best actor list or something like that. I don't quite remember, but it was one I was very high on, including a fantastic performance by him. This movie is supposedly about a beloved children's author, but it's not. It unfortunately suffers from the problem that a lot of biopics or movies based on true story. I think movies based on true stories is the better way to look at it, in a sense of they focus on the wrong person, sort of similar to like Green Book, where instead of it being about the Mahershala Ali character, the story instead is about the Viggo Mortensen character, when it's like, well, that's not really what the story was about. The story was about this, black musician traveling through the South in areas where he wasn't allowed to be traveling and all this sort of stuff. The same way in this movie, Father of the Milky Way Railroad is about a beloved children's author, except for it's more about his father and his sister and the rest of the family and the mother and the grandfather and all this sort of stuff. And it really feels like the actual main character of this movie barely gets any screen time. And he clearly has some unfortunate mental health problems. So the few times we do get scenes focusing on him, it's usually him having a manic episode. And so we're left not really caring about this person and not exactly enjoying these scenes, because the only scenes we get of him are these really tough ones to sit through, where it's him, unfortunately having an episode that's making everyone else uncomfortable. And, someone has to come in to sort of save the day and make things right and calm. And then they switch to the next scene, which is no longer about the son, this supposed author. So it's very frustrating. I don't know if you had heard anything about this or knew anything about this one before we talked about it.
I didn't know. I was interested in it because, again, similar to Plan 75, like it had just won, it didn't win anything, but it was like recognized, right? Like it was recognized critically and on the awards run. So I kind of thought, like that's interesting to see what is being awarded in Japan and elsewhere around the world as well for this film. But yeah, I was going to watch it, and then you came and said, it's not that great. I was like, oh, okay. I was like, I'll just forget about it then. And I ended up watching the other two films, or three films. But it's too bad though. Can I ask, so usually when I watch a movie at a film festival, and like you said, sometimes you need to watch the good ones to really, the bad ones to realize the good ones and stuff like that. When you watch it though, a movie that doesn't quite click with you, for this particular one, can you see why it was selected? Like, of all the Japanese movies that had gotten submitted for this festival, can you see why, apart from it was awarded and recognized by, such and such, but could you see why the film itself, you thought, oh, this is something that would gravitate towards, why a programmer would see it and be like, I want to add this to my lineup?
Yeah, I think so, because the main thing is it's got a big star in the Japanese world in Koji Yakusho. So that's obviously a big selling point. And then this is a movie that takes place in the late 1800s all the way up until, I think, like 1935, the movie ends. So it's got this, big expansive look to it. It's a period piece, and it's shot very beautifully. Like, sometimes when you do period piece movies, you can really tell that it's a movie. It doesn't feel like it's actually living in that era. But this movie does actually feel like it's living in this era, and they do a great job with the set design and the costumes and all that sort of stuff, where it's a really nice historical-looking film. The problem, unfortunately, just is completely script-related, where everything is a cliche. You can see each scene from a mile away. Everything is telegraphed way over the top. The lines, the actual dialogue is ridiculous, where there's no subtlety at all. And, we've now harped on this a couple times, where we don't always need things to be spelled out to us. We can understand the inference of things. We can understand subtext, all this sort of stuff. And all that was just completely removed for this movie, in the sense of like, we're going to make sure every character tells everyone exactly how they're feeling in as many words as possible. And so it's really frustrating where, the mantra is show, don't tell. And this movie is tell, 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 tell. We'll show a little bit.
It's just this is off topic, but because I just watched the new Mission Impossible, which has the most exposition of any film, but somehow I'm okay with it. I don't know why, but usually I'm not. And yeah, that's interesting. I think it's interesting comparing the four films like across the board, just in terms of filmmaking, I guess, because we kind of run the gamut there, where there's one movie where we're like, we kind of wish there was a little bit more explanation about what was going on here, to a movie that you're like, I'm good. You don't need to be that much. And I suppose, and both of those movies too are actually kind of bigger movies for Japan last year. So it's interesting because usually I would associate that type of the exposition dump with movies like a Mission Impossible. Like, I associate it with movies that are these massive Hollywood productions that kind of talk down to their audience a little bit. Whereas something that is more ambiguous and a bit more restrained in that sense, I tend to associate that with indie movies, which isn't correct. It's not a good generalization to have, because there are exceptions to both, many exceptions on both sides. But it's interesting, though, when you kind of do that comparison that we apparently are doing a lot today, but between the movies, like, it's just interesting comparing that within because sometimes I wonder about like different styles of filmmaking. There are certain times in film where you're like, it was very exposition heavy in this time period, or this style of film is very exposition heavy, and then other times, we kind of got rid of that, like it's just pendulum swings. But this is same country, the exact same year being made. So there's not really that. It just, I don't know, just shows the variation, I suppose, of good and bad filmmaking.
Yeah, I guess, like, to sort of, describe each of these four movies, Father of the Milky Way Railroad sort of feels like it's meant to be this big family blockbuster of, this is, you can take your grandparents with you, and you can take your young children with you, and everyone will be able to sit there and enjoy this movie about a beloved children's author. And then you get something like Plan 75, which sort of feels like it's, it's meant for an older audience that sort of is a bit more aware of socially the problems we're facing, but it's not done in a way that's going to make you think super critically about it. It's instead like, oh, it's just, it's one of those movies where, like, yes, it's a PG rated movie, but, kids aren't going to like it. Kids aren't going to understand it. This is definitely an adults type movie. And then you've got something like BLMetamorphosis, which really sort of feels like, it's casting a wide net, but because, it handles its comedy and its heart in equal parts very well, it sort of is one of those movies that, like, oh wow, this is a crowd pleasing movie. This is something that, like, we probably didn't expect, but lots of people are really appreciating it and connecting to it. And then you get Rollless, which really sort of feels like of the four, like the movie lovers type of movie, where you have to be more in tune to understanding the way movie conventions are set up, so that way you can understand what rules they are breaking in order to tell their story. It's one of those types of movies where you often talk about, like, things like musicians, where you need to know music theory in order to know what rules to break.
That's interesting. I've never thought about that.
Yeah. So I don't know. I don't know if you feel sort of similar about the way I described 3 of the 4 movies that you saw, but that sort
Absolutely.
of seems like the gamut that we watched.
Absolutely. And I think that kind of inadvertently, though, because we didn't mean to pick movies that did it this way. But I would completely agree. I think that we've fulfilled the nice spectrum, the nice film world spectrum, because again, though, we didn't mean to do that on purpose. But I suppose if you just kind of aim a dart at like a film festival lineup, that's going to end up happening. Like, you are rarely gonna, well, hopefully, anyways, a good festival lineup shouldn't all be the same type of movie for the same audience. Like, it should run fairly wide in its view, unless it's obviously like a niche film festival. But for something like this, when you're trying to appeal to many different groups, and I will say, actually, the Plan 75 screen, so that was the only in-person one that I went to. It was packed. Like, I was not expecting such a big crowd, but it was very busy for considering the year before that I went. Some of them are kind of mildly attended. Again, maybe I shouldn't compare because they were still, we were all still dealing with lockdowns and things like that.
Yeah. Was the crowd mostly receptive to Plan 75?
Seems like, I mean, it's not the kind of movie that you can really gauge audience.
Yeah, because it's not like a comedy or
yeah,
something
like
that where you can
there's
feel
no
it.
like
Yeah.
whooping and cheering in Plan 75. But they did have a doctor come in to talk afterwards about the ethical issues surrounding something like the Plan 75 program, like what they're talking about. I didn't end up staying for that, but I thought it was interesting that they decided to get in somebody like a medical expert rather than like a film person to come in to talk about it. But like again, that, I mean, we're just bringing it back to Plan 75, but it just shows it's a really, really interesting topic and one that is very topical right now. I mean, I think it's still a movie worthwhile to check out, but maybe just don't buy into all the hype that's around it.
Yeah, I think that's actually a perfectly fair one because, yeah, it does present some pretty interesting themes. It just maybe doesn't communicate them in a way that you would hope it does.
Yeah, absolutely. 100% agree. Sign off on that one. Seconded. We're really in agreement on this episode. We're doing well.
We are. And, I feel like most of the time we are usually.
We are actually. Yeah, we usually are. With the exception of like Wes Anderson, I think, and like random or like what is it? Face Off, which I don't know what your problem is about that movie. But generally speaking, I think we are on the same page when it comes to movies.
Yeah. So I don't know if it's just like a little behind the scenes talk here of like the episode planning that we do, because we sort of talk it out and be like, hey, would you be interested in doing this? Yeah, okay, let's do this. So we're already sort of on a similar wavelength or not. We're very different from Matt and Simon, who are always arguing with each other on Awesome Friday. But
I also think the format is different because
it is.
Yeah, they're just picking whatever movie's coming out that week. Yeah. So, you're going to get, if we did that, I'm sure we would probably not, I don't think we disagree all the time though, actually. But I think when we plan episodes out, when I say we, it's usually you. When you plan an episode out, it's like when we're picking movies to watch, we're not picking stuff that we think is shit. Like we're not going to pick stuff that we're like, oh, this film festivals maybe slightly different because we don't really get a say in that. So if we end up watching a bunch of stinkers, then, but that hasn't happened though. I don't think that's happened.
No, not really.
Like I haven't come away from a film festival where I'm like, I didn't watch anything that I liked. Like there's always something that I think is fun or good.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I think that's a perfect way to sort of wrap up this episode. Do you have anything that you're working on or you wish to promote, and where can people find you? All that usual good stuff. I'll link to Jericho's film review of what was it, Plan 75? From
yeah. You can go to. I'm on Twitter and Instagram at _RachelKH. You can go to my website, which is rachelho.com. In terms of promoting, actually, so it did just go live while we were recording. I contributed a small part to CBC Arts' bigger article or feature that they were doing, which was counting down the 50 greatest films directed by Canadians, which I believe you voted on as well.
I did.
So they asked a bunch of critics and other movie people to vote on what they believed was, I think they asked for our top 10s, right? Top 10 best movies just directed by a Canadian. It wasn't necessarily a Canadian movie. And yeah, they just released the list today. So when this episode goes out, it will definitely be online. And I was asked to write about David Cronenberg's Crash, which is always a good time for me. I enjoy Cronenberg's work. So yeah, that was good. And that is on the CBC website. And I will give you the link, Dakota, whenever.
I'm looking at it right now. Oh. Are they selling these posters that they made? Because these are absolutely incredible.
Okay, I'm going to give her a shout out because I completely agree. They sent us, they sent me my poster. It's not mine. They sent me the Crash poster ahead of time and I looked at it and I went, this is amazing. This is fantastic. So I'm going to get you the name. So the illustrator's name, she did, I believe, all of the illustrations, definitely all of the posters. But there's a really lovely animation right up at the top of the article. I'm not 100% sure she did that, but I think she did. And her name is Marie Bergeron, and she is on Instagram at MB_illustrations. And I think her work is tremendous. I was so impressed with the posters too. I think they're beautiful.
Yeah,
like the Crash one looks sick.
Wow.
Like I was really, that looks so good.
Like for real, I need to. This is now completely off topic, but I need to see if she's going to be selling these prints because stunning. Like I cannot get over this enough. Yes, so I'm definitely going to be linking this in the show notes and sharing lots about this stuff. I'm very excited to read through all of it, especially your write up on Crash, a movie that made my list as well. And sort of go through. I just quickly scan through the top 10 and have it look through the whole top 50. Very interesting choice because of subject, because we often talk about the best Canadian films, stuff like that. It's a little tricky sometimes being like, was this a Canadian film or not? And then of course there could be a Canadian film with non-Canadian creatives behind it and all that sort of stuff, and then Canadian filmmakers like James Cameron or Denis Villeneuve, who don't really make Canadian films anymore. More so Villeneuve, who used to but doesn't anymore. Cameron never made Canadian
I was gonna say,
films.
I don't even think Cameron ever did he?
No, because he basically got his start with I'm blanking on his name. What's his name that makes the B movies? That basically gave his start to everyone. Either way, whatever. But yeah, so like you consider James Cameron a part of the Canadian canon, but not in the same way of like, well, it's not like David Cronenberg or Sarah Polley or something like that.
I will admit it. Every now and then I forget that James Cameron's Canadian. I completely forget that he is, because, and it's not saying he's a bad Canadian by any shape. Like there's no such thing as a good Canadian or a bad Canadian. He is Canadian, obviously. I just forget about it because sometimes when, we have so many creatives in this country who they really fly the flag. Like even Ryan Reynolds, who is, he is completely
his Twitter handle is still Van City Reynolds.
Yeah, but he is such a Hollywood guy now, right? Like he's so Hollywood, but he will mention Canada. He will still be very involved in, like he was involved in the Sick Kids charitable drive a year or two ago, I think. Like, so he's still quite involved in Canadian stuff. Michael J. Fox, same thing. I will never not know that not recall that he's Canadian. James Cameron, though, someone that I just think like he went to Hollywood and then that was it. I'm sure he comes home to visit family, I assume. I don't know. I don't know James Cameron very well. We're not friends.
He's from London, Ontario, I think, right?
And that's the other thing. I don't know what it is. He strikes me as a BC guy, but then I'm like, oh, he's from Ontario. Like, I don't know why I think that, though. I don't know where that comes from, that I think that obviously he's from BC. And then I'm like, oh, he's just from Ontario. Great.
Also, I remembered it. James Cameron got to start with Roger Corman. That was the name I was trying to remember.
So, yeah, but it's a cool list. I like the idea of it. I think that, not to say that, the Canadian film lists aren't worthwhile, but there's a lot of really, really great Canadian directors out there, and who have made a mark, not just in Canada, but like around the world in terms of the film industry as a whole. So I think that it's cool that they did this kind of list that recognizes that a little bit more than recognizing just pure Canadian films. And there are some movies on there that are just Canadian films. Like they're not all just Hollywood lists. So I think of all the people who voted, which I believe is many, I don't know if they published how many people ended up voting, but I think a lot of people ended up doing it. So I think they ended up getting a really nice, a nice variety of films across the board. Cronenberg's there a few times, nice. I believe.
Yeah.
Unsurprisingly.
No shock. Yeah. Cool. Okay. Well, this has been a That Shelf podcast. Visit thatshelf.com for more great film discourse. Follow the show on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at contrazoompod. Did you see anything at the Toronto Japanese Film Festival this year? Let us know and send an email to contrazoompod@gmail.com. Thank you to Eric and Kevin Smale for the theme music and to Stephanie Pryor for the logo design. If you like to listen to podcasts on YouTube, we do post all episodes there as well. And if you really like the show, consider tipping us on coffee. Thanks for checking us out.